of global capitalism in the 21st century. If this is the case, I'm doubtful that there is much a new approach to cultural policy can do to address the systemic causes of mass immiseration and superfluity. And yet, in the raised voices of the periphery, there is an important call to be heeded. And it is a call that Banshees in Vienna are already seeking to amplify. And it is a call to recognize that the state of emergency in which we live in labor is not the exception, but the rule. As Susan Marks, invoking Walter Benjamin's call for a real state of emergency, has written, quote, "Superfluity too must be made real. A real superfluity reclaims in the wayness for those struggling to transform the conditions in which human superfluity is produced and reproduced," end quote. This is not just a task for a vanguard periphery somewhere else. It's a task for all of us, because the periphery is here and the future is now. Thank you.
There's time for some questions?
If you have to leave, that's also okay. Emiko, yes.
I don't want to be the first because I'm an outsider and don't know anything about. But it was very impressive, and from an anthropological point of view, it really opens up new directions. The last San Francisco anthropological meeting, everybody was talking about Precariat, but I really did not see such an incisive connection to post-multiculturalism. But my dear Pierre Bourdieu may not be as pleased when he talked about this because his model is all the symbolic violence is trickling down from, and then upper class doxa is going down. And that's the predominant model, and you were talking something different. But I was very struck by the potential of this music, but then it does have the attention. In one sense, you talked about belonging is one of the music's strong, but anthropological belonging has been autonomy, the land and all that. But the music has this tension of enormous appeal to your collective self on one hand, and yet it travels. You know, it's world jazz. And then, as Stephen Feld said, that Beethoven's Nine is something that really rings bell in Africa as well as in Japan. And so there's this very interesting tension that it's very rich, which anthropologists haven't been able to really come to terms with.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what's sort of emergent here is a sense of a counter-cosmopolitanism, if you like, in the same way that Gilroy theorizes a counter-modernity, that the sort of global ghetto becomes an alternative kind of cosmopolis. That this is very locally rooted music in a lot of ways. It's being used to represent the city of Belém to the rest of Brazil and to the world, and yet it's very much engaged in these kinds of dialogues with other forms of productive precariat music in Africa, Angolan kuduro. From Colombia, there's kind of cumbia groove that's snuck in there. These kinds of dialogues, I think, they give weight to the kinds of arguments that Hermano Viana and others are sort of advancing, that there's really an alternative sphere, public sphere, in which these kinds of cultural production are allowing participation in. Now, I don't want to get into the morass of Habermasian public sphere and whether this is something.
It's very enlightenment.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm not sure really what the emancipatory potential of this is, but I think you're right that belonging is being opened up in some ways through this music at the same time that sort of rootedness is being re-entrenched. We could think about that in terms of mobility, the kinds of mobilities that this kind of cultural production opens up for these artists to travel to Recife, to travel to São Paulo. In fact, a similar group that's kind of a cousin group to Gabi just played at South by Southwest this last year in the US. So yeah, thank you. I could go on and on, but I should probably not.
Of course, now in your seminar, we've read some of Viana's argument. He kind of made this argument for like techno-brega kind of, obviously there's this mainstream, right? Globo's grabbing onto it, UW's grabbing onto it. But he also made all these arguments for all of these kind of bootlegs and underground sources of production. Like you pointed out, with most people are not aren't getting their techno-brega through Globo. But so do you see this as kind of a beginning trend in Globo and Vivo doing this type of reappropriation, or a continuing trend, or do you think there is some, like, would there maybe be something of an argument for that system of production, despite Globo making some attempts to reappropriate it? So I guess, what do you see as the kind of the effectiveness of those types of reappropriations in contrast with the informal?
Yeah, thanks. I think this is very clearly a continuation of a lot of trends, especially since the 90s, of commodifying forms of peripheral musical creation that essentially subsidize a dying, or what appears to be this sort of dying centralized music industry. So there's a way in which that appropriation isn't new at all, and you could even see in the way that certain types of samba were commodified, beginning in the 30s by the radio industry. They're going to the favela, but it's always through that intermediary of the white songwriter who goes and sort of translates it. That this is a very old dynamic. I think what's troubling though in the narrative that this video sketches out about the relationship between the informal economy and the formal economy is still this kind of telos that everything is tending toward, celebration and canonization. That ultimately she knows she's made it when her stuff is being sold in stores and is being sold in when she's being played on telenovelas, right, primetime soap operas. So what someone like Ronaldo Lemos, although I'm very suspicious of his agenda of incorporation, he's really calling for the legalization of what he says is the de facto social commons that this kind of music and production has created. Right? That there's a form of sharing that's very rapid, that doesn't get hung up with copyright laws because there's nobody there to enforce them anyway, right? So his idea is, how do you legalize that so that you don't continually have this kind of cycle of appropriation and expropriation by a center, and the sort of utopian pie in the sky idea that is that, well, it's going to become so big that it'll eventually just overtake, displace. These centralized music industries will no longer have any legitimacy, but that's not what we've seen at all. So I hope that kind of answers your question. Yeah, Mark.
I'm not sure if my question is a little bit off topic, but first of all, thanks for the very insightful, very helpful. But my question is, I was thinking about during the presentation about this techno-brega thing, and how does this kind of exposition of this North, I should say, cultura do norte, or North music, into the southeastern Brazil, or even other regions in Brazil, as you mentioned, Recife in the northeast and so on, it really changed this pejorative sort of vision that Brazil usually against the North, in general, North and northeastern Brazil. how this change or this perpetuate this. Did you think about that? How?
Oh, yeah.
Because I don't know, just what you think about it.
Yeah, you know, on the one hand, equal representation in the public sphere seems to be this multicultural mode, you know, made manifest. Yeah, we've done it, you know, like now we can hear the sounds from the Amazon and we never could before. That's great, right? Obviously there's a dynamic of there's this gatekeeping mechanism here that selects certain sounds and not others, that someone like Vladimir Cunha, who's a journalist, and he's made a documentary called Precariat, which is a great documentary about the informal economy that sort of undergirds this system. This is just so much exoticism, you know, Gabi prancing around in leopard skins and Indian feathers, you know, and the sort of cultural this sort of cognitive dissonance of Amazonian Indians doing, you know, digital, you know, dance music. That's really what's being sold here. So there are people who think that this is just more of the same kind of exoticizing of the peripheries. I don't know. I think I'm not prepared to sort of position myself one way or the other. I think it's just very interesting to see the way that, you know, the state government has really been very active in selling a very specific idea of Paraense culture, this Terroir Pará project that the state government invested in to take to São Paulo. Is very much in this multicultural mode. You know, they spent millions of dollars on this. And for a lot of folks, it really has lifted their opportunities to travel abroad. You know, one of the guys that I work with most closely is now 70-some years old. Always just sort of performed in informality. You know, he has a pension now from the government as kind of, you know, immaterial patrimony he himself is. So, you know, there are tangible consequences, I think, for this kind of fame, but it's always in kind of this trickle-down mode, you know. So the question of emancipation seems to be a very important question, but I'm not sure you can get there from here. I guess it's kind of how I feel at this point. Thank you. Tim?
I just kind of wondered how your research aligns with your actual, you know, music performance. Did you sort of, I mean, I'm sure you've probably been playing for a long time, but does your music, you know, sort of drive your research, or the other way around? How does it affect what you play and types of things?
Yeah. No, I wouldn't say my music drives my research. I've been a performing musician all my life, essentially, but you know, since I decided to be, you know, essentially be an anthropologist of music, the role of music for me is as a tool, as a medium for advancing the sort of research that I think is important to do, for bringing people from Brazil to perform here, which is something I was able to do at UT Austin last year. These kinds of connections that having a musical competency, I think, facilitates in some way making those connections, and also being attentive to the material needs of performing musicians who, in Brazil, you know, we talked about this in seminar last week, you can be super famous, you know, by all measures, both in the informal economy and formal, but really have nothing materially to show for a life spent devoted to your craft. So, yeah, thanks.
I guess I have a question to help me understand a little bit even more what you're trying to say. So you said, I thank you for your presentation. It's not a critique, though. Although you said at the beginning that you sort of assume that the audience know about Brazilian conceptions of multiculturalism, and I'm curious about what that is, because when I did my research in Brazil, I would more encounter interculturalidade than multiculturalism, so I wonder whether you could just explain it a little bit.
Can you say a little bit more about interculturality?
So I'm trying to understand, because I was a little bit confused what sort of, like when you talk about culture,
Mhm.
what do you mean about culture? Right? Because I'm doing research in education, so I do think about culture as being something different than probably you. Like when you use the term, you probably use it differently than I use it. So one of so under Lula and very recently in Brazil, what you have is like trying to like revamp like the history that Brazil shares
Mhm.
with Africa, right? And then it has to do with race. So I wonder what people's understanding of multiculturalism versus integration. So they're because they use it. So I'm researching a university that does federal university in Brazil that does cooperations with with Portuguese-speaking African countries, and part of that is that in education they're trying to like we have to teach what we owe to Africa. So there's a different idea coming up that I don't think is necessarily the same that what you have with multiculturalism in the U.S. Right?
No,
because
no.
the U.S. you have this melting pot of things, or like people are coming in with their distinct, and whereas it seems to be more of a continuum with race and culturally in Brazil, right? So,
Yeah.
and so I was wondering, what do you mean by multiculturalism? And I understand your argument and how it is going to be sold, which is a numerous argument.
Thanks. Yeah. I'll say that my understanding of the practice of multiculturalism in Brazil comes mainly through George Udac's work with like Afro-Hegi and other kinds of NGOs like this that really starting in the 90s, early 90s, sort of attempt to come to terms with this problem of human rights in this sort of post-dictatorship period. That culture and sort of this cultural inheritance becomes a wedge to use against sort of historical exclusion. That I think, interculturality. This idea is I don't know the history of that term in Brazil, but I think that's kind of a somewhat newer conception that. UDC doesn't really sort of get into this at all. The idea of culture that is kind of at the heart of this multiculturalism paradigm is one that is at once kind of receive historical patrimony, but also a performance, right? That because of that, enables it to be commodified in particular ways and brought into specific regimes of value economies that, the kind of national popular model, I guess, is thinking about multiculturalism as a departure from the national popular model that dominated in the 60s and 70s in Brazil. That's kind of the point at which I'm situating this. I can speak a little bit more. I'd be interested to know a little bit more about interculturality. Yeah.
Very much complimenting this comment here. My perception and experience with Brazil in the sciences is very much in this line. Something that amazed me in the sciences to see how, all right, there's Italian, Japanese, they're German, they're Lebanese. Oh no, but this is all Brazilian.
Mm.
This method is integration rather than multi-multi. It's very much in the same perception as what we just said.
Right. Yeah. I think that is a legacy of the kind of racial democracy paradigm that has been kind of Brazil's international calling card, if you like, since the 50s. That this model of racial mixture, that you're in stark contradistinction to the U.S., where you're African American before you're American, or you're Asian American before you're American. In Brazil, you're Brazilian before you're Afro-Brazilian.
But you cannot be Brazilian without being Afro-Brazilian.
Yeah. So So I think that has a lot of critical purchase still, particularly in the way that Brazil tries to export a certain image and notion of itself abroad. Within Brazil, particularly after the dictatorship, that was a legacy that had to be dismantled for the fact that racial discrimination still continued to exist under Brazil. No matter how many decades you spend saying it's a racial democracy and we're all equally mixed and we're all Afro-Brazilian, I mean that had a very sort of chilling effect on the ability of Afro-Brazilians who, I mean this debate is still raging. There's an evangelical federal deputy that's been saying, Africans are are subhuman, that has been sort of promoting this on a national level, that, this kind of discourse is still, this is something, like Zizek says, there are certain things that should just be hegemonic, should just be obvious. We shouldn't still be debating, the humanity of Afro-Brazilians, and yet, there's a way in which post 1985, that was kind of a preliminary step that a lot of people felt was necessary to make to sort of address these historic exclusions of Afro-Brazilians, or the kind of sweeping under the carpet of racial injustice, under the pretense that we're all mixed anyway. So hopefully that speaks to some of that debate.
Right. Well, so I mean, I will be here for another year. So thank you for.